NATO after President Trump chose not to affirm his support for the alliance in May.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense.
The president's unpopularity in the region already sparking protests, with thousands expected to converge on Hamburg during the summit.
Many Europeans are also quite upset with President Trump's decision for the U.S. to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. According to the Chinese government's press agency just yesterday, Russia and China pledged to jointly push implementation of that agreement. Allison, Chris.
Suzanne, thank you very much. Let's bring in our panel to discuss it all. We have CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza, Bloomberg News White House reporter Shannon Pettypace, and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. David, I want to start with you. You have a piece in the New York Times this morning. What can Trump do about North Korea? What's the answer to that?
Well, Allison, his options are not good, and he has discovered over the past 6 months, I think in a pretty abrupt, some might even say brutal way, that it's a lot easier to make ultimatums about what the North Koreans will not do than to actually stop them. He's got sort of four major steps he could take. He could try the incremental increase in sanctions that Secretary Tillerson referred to in that statement last night, in which the United States admitted that this was, in fact, an ICBM. No one I know believes that's likely to work. The North Koreans aren't especially sensitive to this. They're not going to give up their missile and nuclear programs, which they view key to their survival, in return for easing some sanctions, or at least that's the view of almost everybody who's been through this before, from the Clinton through Bush administrations and into the Obama administration. They could think about military options, including preemptive strikes, when they saw a missile launch preparing. But as Barbara pointed out from the Pentagon, they didn't even understand what this missile was as it was preparing for launch. They could, if they wanted to, try to do much heavier interception of all North Korean exports, intercept ships at sea and so forth, but that risks conflict. And, of course, they could open negotiations, which President Trump at various moments during the campaign and again a few months ago suggested he might go ahead and do, but that would essentially be acknowledging that North Korea is a nuclear power here to stay.
All right, quick follow for you, David. General Brooks said the only thing that kept war from breaking out after this test was self-restraint. Common sense would dictate that that's always what stops war from breaking out, self-restraint, but this is an unusual statement, is it not?
It is, and it jumped out at me too, Chris, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because we sometimes forget that the agreement that was reached at the end of the Korean War in 1953 was an armistice, not a peace treaty, which means that the two sides are technically at war. We don't think about that each and every day. The North Koreans think about it intently, and it tells you what a hair trigger all of this is on. So one of the big calculations that President Trump's going to have to make is whether or not to so increase the pressure that you could end up seeing Kim Jong-un lash out, because he believes it's our plot to unseat him as the leader of North Korea. That's his biggest fear. And that's why you've seen President Xi and President Putin, both of whom Mr. Trump will be seeing later this week, both make the case for a freeze on missile and nuclear activity in return for the U.S. pulling back on all military exercises on the Korean Peninsula.
Shannon, we can see how complicated this is in the spectrum of responses that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has had about North Korea. So yesterday he released that long statement that you may have just seen in the piece, talking about how North Korea is a global threat. Back in April, he tried a different tact, very different, in fact, the opposite, where he put this out, this official statement: North Korea launched yet another intermediate-range ballistic missile. The United States has spoken enough about North Korea. We have no further comment. So that didn't work. I mean, I understand trying that. That sounded good at the time, like we're not even going to entertain, we're not even going to humor them, but that didn't work.
And the playbook of options is running thin. I think, though, that President Trump is probably instinctually going to want to move towards the talk and negotiation stage in the playbook. He's talked before about wanting to reopen talks with North Korea, wanting to talk directly with them under the right circumstances. They always, put that caveat around that. But that's how he sees himself dealing with issues. If I can just get someone in the room and talk to them, if we can just talk this out, work out some deal, the old great Donald Trump deal maker thing. But that is how he views trying to resolve these conflicts, is trying to talk them out directly. And I would not be surprised if his instinct is pushing him to that way. Again, of course, because militaristically, there's not any good options. Diplomatically, there are not good options. We are kind of running out of the playbook here.
Well, also, you're seeing here play out, Chris Cillizza, his instincts, the president's instincts, getting in his own way. This isn't figuring out development rights for a hotel in Manhattan, where you can start off heavy and aggressive and berating, and then that's just your first position and you back off. Words matter on the geopolitical scale in a different way. So he heads into the G20, where he's got allies upset about what he said, and he's going to meet with Vladimir Putin, where his words have put him in a little bit of an odd capacity there with him as well. So how important is this trip for the president to use his words in a new way?
I think it is important. I think anytime a president, it's not unique to Donald Trump, anytime a president goes to a major foreign stage, it matters. I think it matters even more with Donald Trump, given his inexperience doing so, and given that the first trip was not all that well received by Europe, which I know cheers Trump supporters, but does matter geopolitically in ways beyond just sort of our traditional domestic politics. You know, we're not even talking about the Trump tweets. You mentioned words mattering, Chris. We're not talking about the Trump tweets, which basically say, doesn't this guy have anything better to do about Kim Jong-un? Which is not exactly. Diplomacy by Twitter is probably, I always defer to David Sanger on these things, but I'm not sure that that's sort of a historically effective precedent. What we don't know with Donald Trump is whether or not he can sort of contain his natural sort of provocative instincts. I think Shannon's right. He is sort of a deal maker, but he also has this piece to him that is a provocateur. He likes to say and do things that cause reaction and then sort of revel in the reaction. We've seen that in the last week between the tweets about Mika Brzezinski, Joe Scarborough, and the clothesline tweet, for lack of a better word, about CNN. Those have impact stateside, but it's not as impactful as, frankly, if you do it on the international stage. So I think he is a man divided. He likes to provoke. He likes to be tough, right? The era of strategic patience is over. At the same time, there are no good options. There is no simple solution here, and words do matter. So there's a lot of Trump natural instincts sort of colliding with one another, and I don't know, candidly, what that produces.